Teachers, as you come back this school year, we would like to show you how each and every one of you has had such a big impact on us.
Mr. Coombs, Mrs. Downey,
Mrs. Emmons,
Mr. Coggins,
Mrs. Schneider,
Mrs. Hartley, Senora Halcomb,
Mr. Parks,
Miss Wimkin,
Mr. Murphy,
Mrs. Candy,
Mrs. Baker,
Mr. Carlson.
you push students to limits they never knew were possible.
Mr. Johnson,
Mrs. Bartlett,
Mrs. Helms, Mrs. Cox, Mr. Bart,
Mr. Dickin,
Mr. Serger, Mr. Jacob,
Miss Nicholas, Mr. Savachko,
Mr. Shepard,
Mr. Blasio,
Mrs. Vore,
Mrs. Moorhead,
Mr. Smith, Mr. Grippa,
Mrs. Homer,
Mrs. Parker,
Mr. Winkler,
Mr. Metzger,
Mrs. Lynch, Mr. Fagan,
Mr. Yards,
Miss Roebuck,
Mr. Shaker,
Mrs. Kaufman,
Your influence can never be erased.
Mr. Camello,
Mrs. Porter,
Mr. Riker,
Miss Catterson,
Mr. Ackerman,
Mr. Leeper,
Mr. Smith, Mrs. O'Neill, Mr. Tucker, Miss Ackerman, Mr. Meyer,
Mrs. Friesenberg,
Mr. Dumfries,
Miss Wilson,
Mr. Despenna, Mrs. Williams,
Miss Kirkland, Mrs. English,
Mrs. Arbor,
You inspire hope, ignite the imagination, and spark a love for learning.
Mrs. Metzger,
Mr. Klaus,
Mr. Fritz,
Mrs. Chandler,
Mrs. Gregory,
Miss Riemann,
Mrs. Houghton,
Mrs. McSwain, Miss McKinney,
Mrs. Carpenter,
Mrs. Von Hove,
Miss Lynch,
Senora West,
Mrs. Wiseman,
Mr. Gillespie,
Teachers plant seeds of knowledge that last a lifetime.
Mr. Corral,
Mr. Jordan,
Frau Goff,
Mr. Cameron,
Miss Walsh, Mrs. Norsworthy,
Mrs. Teskey,
Miss Jason, Mrs. Davison,
Mr. Rose,
Mr. Lutz,
Mrs. Carrier,
If you teach today, may someday light the world.
Mr. Siciliano,
Chung Lusher, Mr. Leeson,
Senora Wolf,
Mrs. Lyden,
Mrs. Rude,
Mrs. McDonough,
Mrs. Satek,
Miss Bennett,
Mr. Hall,
Mr. Desmond, Mrs. Pittenger,
Mrs. Wolfer,
Miss Woods,
Mrs. Dolezal,
Mr. Ball,
Mr. Kilgore,
Senora Williams,
Senora Yulee,
Mr. Underwood, Senora Barrett, Miss Ball,
Mr. Chapman,
Mrs. Panko, Mr. Bernetti,
Dr. Daly,
all new teachers starting their Milford journey.
You change the world, one student at a time.